Hey HTDA, and welcome back to my Satisfactory 1.0 Masterclass. In each episode I'll give you one specific goal to work towards, and ideally you should be able to complete that goal in 1 or 2 playing sessions. Before this episode you should have already completed phase 2, and the game is pretty much going to tell you that you're going to be overwhelmed. And the game is right, because honestly I think this is probably the part of the game where a lot of players are starting to drop off, because you can produce like 10 new items during this stage, and it's not super clear if you're a new player what you should be building in which order. There's trains to play with. Long story short, it is really overwhelming and confusing, so that's where I come in. So in other words, getting to phase 3 completion is actually going to require a couple of different steps, because we just need a lot of new stuff. In order to make sure you can easily follow along, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to show you that step by step, and we're going to be building that larger factory in separate modules. I will link below in the description to a building planner for every module, so you can actually check and uncheck the alternate recipes that you do and do not have, and adjust your builds accordingly if you want. And I'm also going to be linking to a full build that we're aiming for in the long run for the completion of this entire phase, so that will be stretching multiple episodes. Now what I'm actually going to do is I am going to completely redesign my starting base. Now I just want to be clear, you do not need to do this. It's perfectly fine if you keep your starting base running. You might be syncing those items. It actually gives you a lot of points. But what I actually want to do is make full use out of all those precious resources we have over here that we're now kind of letting go to waste, because we're just using Mark 1 miners, Mark 1 and 2 belts and things like that. And we can just do so much better with the resources we have available to us now. Taking this approach actually is also going to allow me to show you some different building techniques, which is very useful I hope for this masterclass, but it's also going to allow me to show you that you should probably be setting up your mall differently than we've been doing so far. Just to make sure that you understand, setting up your mall like this is, well, perfectly fine, and it looks really good as well, and it's really efficient in the early game, but once you unlock the dimensional depots, I think this type of mall is a little bit outdated, and I'll show you some alternatives as we go. Right, so that was a very long intro, apologies for that, but I felt it was important to explain to you what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and how I'm going to be doing it. So, first things first, what if you also want to try and redesign your starting base? Part of what makes actually removing your old factory and replacing it with a new one super annoying is that you will have a ton of resources popping up all over the place that you then need to manually go and pick up, or they will be littering your map for a very long time. You can solve most of that problem by simply deleting the inputs from the miners early on in the base, and then just let the base run for a little bit while you're doing some other stuff. That means the last remaining ores will then be consumed, the last remaining whatever it is producing will be consumed, so it actually clears out most of your belts before you have to start thinking about taking everything down. And again, last time I'll say this, but just to be clear, you do not need to take down your starting base if you don't want to, you can just leave it running. Now, while the main base is actually draining out, I'm going to start out with designing a nice looking steel facility for a couple of reasons. Steel is something that's quite isolated, but it's also used in Mark III belts as well as a lot of other things. So getting your steel mill up and running is actually super useful, so you can ensure that even if you're taking down that main base, you're never going to run out of Mark III belts. In order to allow yourself to build efficiently, you're going to need some blueprints, and those blueprints can actually be super simple. The ones I am using are typically just a combination of different machines, all hooked up to power. I'm not even using things like splitters, mergers, belts and stuff like that in there, because it might depend a little bit on the situation what type of belts I want to use. And on top of that, I'm usually using things like floor holes where the direction might matter. So just making sure I have several machines together, nicely laid out and connected to power is already going to save me a lot of time. In this steel build, I am going to use the solid steel ingot recipe, mostly because it allows me to make more steel out of the same amount of incoming resources, because as you can see it's 3, 3 and 3 here, but if I just make the iron ingots first and using this recipe I only need 2 ingots as well as 2 coal to make the same 3 steel, so it's actually a lot more efficient. Now that is nothing you can solve if you don't have this recipe by simply using the default recipe. You might need to slightly overclock some of your miners. I am not actually overclocking anything here, so just put in a power shard or 2 and you should be just fine and good to go. It does mean, however, that I first need to make some ingots, so I'm doing that here with the smelter build that I just showed you. Now the nice thing is, if you're using these recipes, that you can just copy and paste these so you can see it looks really, really nice. And I actually built 2 of these sets really close together, so close together actually that you can't even see the belts going into the splitter. There is a belt in here, so you do actually need to select the belt and try to put it in here. And it's already connected, so I can't really show you now. But this is how close you can actually build your factories together. As you can see, you can actually walk through them now. The nice thing about a layout like this is that I can actually bring in the resources from the ground floor, as you can see over here. It's then producing. I decided not to bring them down right away just yet, because that kind of clutters the logistics floor. And I am just bringing everything back together into this merger. And then this lift over here is actually going down below into the floor, and then delivers the ingots to the next stage of this build. Alright, so these are 8 smelters producing a total of 240 ingots, and those are leading into 3 sets of 2 foundries that you can see over here. Just identical setups, just copy paste, but the nice thing about having these different foundry sets is that it allows me to make sure I combine the ingots, because each of these will be producing 60 ingots per minute, so that's 120 in total. So I have 3 belts of 120 coming out once I combine these sets of 2 down below. Which brings me to showing you how the ground floor looks like, the logistics floor I should say. So we have the iron ore coming in over here and the iron ingots coming out over here from the build I just showed you. Then the coal comes in here as well, and it goes into these sets of 2 splitters going into the foundries. Now the nice thing is, the outputs of those foundries are actually here on the top floor. So let me destroy this merger for a moment so you can see what's happening. So I have the lift coming out just below the floor, and then you can actually copy a merger and just place it right on top of the lift like that. Now as you can see, it kind of nicely merges in, and then if you connect a belt to all of that, the belt actually can go on the ceiling. So I can just move around here pretty easily, and I don't have to figure out how to get around all of these belts over here. And this belt is going to go straight into the next line of the production. The next part of that production being these 6 constructors making steel beams. So remember, we have 3 sets of the 2 foundries, which are going to be producing a total of 360 steel beams. That's a lot of steel beams, and those 360 steel beams do not actually fit on a Mark III belt, because that's limited to 270. So this is why I just split them in 3, so I can actually use Mark II belts. It's just 120 per belt, and then feed them into these 6 constructors over here. So what I've actually done is those 3 belts of outputs with the steel are actually going to go into the middle of these constructors. So you have 3 inputs. Basically, each belt is connected to 2 of the constructors, and then the outputs of the constructors are once again going to be lowered here into a merger that is again floating above. It's connected to the ceiling, so it's not like unrealistically floating, but it is very nice to be able to just walk around. All of these mergers connect the outputs up to the belt that is going to go in here into a smart splitter that is actually set to prioritize this belt over here that goes right into the dimensional depot. That means that whenever I consume some of my steel, this dimensional depot will instantly start restocking it. It's always going to be fed by this factory as well, and in the meanwhile I have the overflow going into the rest of my factory. Now I'm going to be building this exact same thing 3 more times, because we're going to need a lot of additional steel and piping. However, I am actually going to make 1 more build producing steel beams, and then the other 2 builds, which are going to look completely identical, are going to be making steel pipes in those constructors. Okay, so just as a quick reminder, I am here in the corner of the rocky desert. We have 3 pure iron nodes over here, as well as 3 pure coal nodes up here. And that is what we're using for this steel factory. That also means that I have this setup over here using 1 coal node and 1 iron node, and that I can replicate pretty much the same build twice more in order to utilize the other 2. Now, what we're going to be doing is I'm actually going to exactly replicate this once more, making even more steel beams. And then the second, or I should say the third facility is going to look extremely similar as well, but it's going to have twice the amount of constructors, and that is going to be making pipes, which when it's done looks something like this. So again, this line is exactly the same as the one we just built, so 8 smelters, 6 foundries and 6 constructors making these steel beams. And then in the final row, can I jump this? Yes, I can. There we go. Okay, so and then in the final row over here, it's, well, almost the same layout, but the difference is that we added in another 6 constructors over here. And I'm really liking these towers to get around. Another 6 constructors here that are making pipes. So these ones are making pipes as well as these, and these are actually drawing from the same resource. So they're all getting their steel ingots from this main line over here. It's just that the pipes need a lot less steel ingots compared to the actual steel beams. Now, even though this is a very simple factory, it's set up just with a couple of blueprints, honestly. I didn't even add in things like edges or a roof or walls or anything like that. It already looks pretty good, and the only trick here is that the blueprints that I've made are very consistent in their looks. And, well, honestly, making sure you keep organized like this in nice equal groupings and things like that, and leaving some space in between your factory just avoids all the spaghetti. And of course the logistics area helps with that as well, because most of the actual spaghetti, or at least the belts kind of crossing each other and things like that, is all below floors. Now on top of that, if you would want to add a second floor to this, you can very easily do that, because all you need to do is something like this, and of course you can extend that floor in whatever direction you want, and you can start building an entire new floor on top of this. I would again include a logistics area if you do that. But as you can see, this is super easy. It also looks super natural because, well, everything is actually supported by these beams. So yeah, extending your factory in a vertical direction is also extremely easy if you do it like this. Now, if you do build things like ceilings and multiple floors, etc., I would recommend putting in some lighting, because otherwise your factory is going to get very dark very quickly. But yeah, that's just details. And then another thing you could do is color your factory based on what you're producing there. So for example, I have here the blue for the iron production, then the steel ingots is black, and then we have the actual steel production and pipe production being kind of gray. Honestly, I really like the default layout as well, so this is just completely subjective whether or not you think this actually adds to the look or detracts from it. And then finally, what I really like doing from this point onwards is use the dimensional depots to actually construct the mall without constructing a mall. So what that means is that in the main production line of my factory, in the output, I will put a smart splitter like this that actually has the main line as the overflow, and then the initial lines that it's trying to prioritize go straight into a dimensional depot. So you can see that happening over here. The dimensional depot is full, so at this point the main line just functions as normally. But whenever I start building something, the first thing this build will do is try to put some steel back in my inventory. So that just means that basically this is having a double function. It initially functions as a mall until my inventory is filled, and then it will just function as normally. So there's actually zero production going to waste. Now remember, you can use more than one depot for a single type of material if you want to speed it up. So if you're building very long belts, like I was actually doing during this specific build to get all the coal and iron here, you might be burning through quite a bit of steel. So I like having 2 depots uploading steel just to double up the speed it gets back into my inventory. But on the other hand, over here for the pipes, I just have a single depot doing the same thing, because honestly I'm never going to need many stacks of pipes at the same time, so a single depot is going to work just fine. And just to ensure we're all on the same page, remember that adding more depots doesn't increase the amount of material you can carry with you, but it does increase the rate at which it is replenished, because this 30 per minute in my case is per depot. So I have 2 of them uploading steel beams, for example, so I actually get 60 steel beams per minute from that. And as always, just to put some finishing touches on your factory, make them already look a lot better without really taking a lot of work. So again, I have put down some edges using the asphalt foundations, and I actually like having the bottom floor stick out a little, because it makes it a lot easier to get around, as you can see. Just make sure you add in some pillars so to avoid the floating fortress type of thing. And the reason I like adding in this kind of tiered layers is because it makes it really easy to just put in some ladders if you need to get around your factory, either from the top to the bottom or vice versa, so you don't need to be doing anything complicated with hypertubes or lifts or anything like that. It works just fine as is. Time to say goodbye to this awesome steel factory and let's move on to the next part. And well, for the next part, I'm going to need some space. Not a lot of space actually, because I'm almost done for this episode. But still, as you can see, my entire factory has come to a standstill. Still, all the resources that I can consume are now off the belt and in their inventories or in the sink. So that should be fairly easy to clean up now. And by the power of time skips, we now have a completely cleared open space here. It's actually a little bit larger than it was, and I actually did lift the entire floor up by 4 meters as well, so we have it nicely aligned with the steel factory there in the back. Now again, you don't need to delete your old entire factory, but yeah, this gives me a lot of room to set up this factory properly this time around. It's worth noting actually that building the floor of a factory is a lot easier when you do that with blueprints, especially if you're like up on high like I am now. And as you can see, this is just a simple 4x4 blueprint with some floors in there, but it's super easy to build a massive part of your floor like this. And this is just the top floor, but you can actually set up the blueprint so it includes both the bottom part of the logistics floor and the top part where you're building your factory. And it's super easy to expand your factory like this. I do want to note that there's these kind of lines in the grid, or I should say in the foundations, that can be really messy if you don't look at where your floor is actually oriented. So if you look and when you're placing a blueprint, you can kind of see on the top here in the northern part of the blueprint, you should see this arrow. This will help you orientate it correctly, so it's pointing north right now. If I would, for whatever reason, flip it around, then these lines would actually start clashing with the lines you already have in place. So as you can see, we have kind of the lines horizontal here, while we have the lines vertical as well. Just saying, if you're placing blueprints, make sure you are watching out for that, because, well, it's a lot neater if they're all pointing in the same direction. Okie dokie, so what's the thing we need most when building a factory? That is concrete. So that is why I'm going to start my factory, or my new factory, with concrete as well. Now you might remember these two nodes over here in the corner that we used all the way in the beginning to set up some early concrete production. Basically, I'm just going to replace these Mark 1 miners with the Mark 2 version, combine the belts and have one single belt going up for 240 limestone coming in. There we go, I'm bringing them up on the logistics floor over here, and I am going to keep my belts on the ceiling as much as possible in this entire factory as well now. So, as you can see, I just bring it up straight away with one of these lifts. I could probably have done that straight away with one lift, but anyway, it's going to go up here into these 6 constructors making concrete. Now, that is about twice as much as we had before. Honestly, if you want, you could scale this up a lot further, because there's no such thing as having too much concrete. But I think it should do for now. Meanwhile, down below, I'm collecting the concrete over here on this belt, as you can see, and it's now going into this smart splitter once again, so that I can divide it, in this case, between 2 of these void storages, or I keep calling them void storages, dimensional depots, I'm sorry. And why 2? Well, again, because we want to have plenty of upload for the concrete, because we're going to be using a lot of that. Honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you set down 4 of these. But yeah, I think 2 should be enough for now. And then the next step is that I'm going to bring in some pipes, because I'm going to use yet another alternate recipe in order to make encased industrial beams. Now, just looking up the recipe for you for a moment. As you can see, normally you would make them from steel, and now we're making them from pipes. It's actually not a big difference. If you don't have this alternate recipe, you would be producing more steel beams instead, and you can just use those. And then very similarly, I have 4 assemblers making those industrial beams. Now, if you are using the normal recipe, you actually only need 3 of these assemblers to make the same amount, which is 16 per minute right now. 16 per minute might not sound like a lot, but it's actually, well, it's a fairly decent amount at this stage of the game. Keep in mind though that if you want to scale this up further, if you are in a location that has a lot of limestone and steel, then you might want to do that, because we're actually also going to be using this for the Mark IV belts later on. So again, there's no such thing as having too much of this, which is also why we're building it first. And of course, once again, I have a smart splitter over here, putting the encased beams into this dimensional depot, not void storage. And yeah, this is going to be a nice little buffer. As you can see, there's already quite a bit in here, so that's going to be a nice stockpile. And by the time we get the rest of our factory up and running, because we are actually going to be using these beams elsewhere as well, the void storage is basically completely up and loaded, and whenever we are actually using them to build, they will get replenished as the first thing. However, because I don't like the idea of wasting my production, I have a storage depot here just to hold the surplus production while we wait for the next part of the factory to be completed. Now, even though this factory looks kind of pitiful right now, we've already done about a quarter of the work we need in order to complete the entire next phase. It doesn't feel like it probably, but all of that steel production that we built in the beginning of this episode, along with limestone and concrete production as well as the beams, are actually a massive part that will make it a lot easier to get all the more complex materials up and running as well, which is what we're going to be working towards in the next episode. If you're still here, you're awesome, and I do hope to catch you in the next one.